This is a story time. Please be seated and grab your popcorn, folks, because this story is going to be a wild ride. All right, let's get started. The wind howled as the Tesla rolled across the empty stretch of desert, a metallic beast gliding over the cracked earth. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving a cold darkness in its wake. The stars twinkled above in a sky untouched by city lights, the vast emptiness pressing in from all sides. Inside the vehicle, Elon Musk sat in the driver's seat, his gaze fixed ahead, never wavering. His fingers tapped absent-mindedly against the steering wheel. Clara, his secretary, sat beside him, watching the barren landscape pass by, her face drawn with unease. "Are we really going to go through with this?" she asked quietly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Elon didn't immediately answer. His eyes remained glued to the road. His mind was somewhere far beyond the desert, beyond even the boundaries of the planet itself. The world was his playground, and he had long learned to trust his instincts above all else. But this place, it felt different. Even he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was horribly wrong. "This is the future, Clara," he said finally, his voice flat, almost detached. "We're about to change everything." Clara bit her lip, glancing at the dashboard. The route they were taking wasn't on any map she had seen. No GPS had marked this road, and the facility they were heading toward was supposed to be a state-of-the-art research center. But there were no signs, no towns, no villages, nothing but miles of nothingness. She had trusted Elon with her career, followed him into countless ambitious projects. But this felt like a step too far. "There are no other cars around," she noted, her voice tinged with anxiety. "No signs of life." "That's the point," Elon replied without looking at her. "It's isolated, a place for pure innovation without distractions." Clara tried to calm her nerves, but the feeling of isolation was palpable. They had been driving for hours through an endless expanse of desert, and now, with every mile, the air seemed to grow heavier, colder. The silence in the car was oppressive, each second stretching longer than the last. It felt like they were heading into the mouth of some ancient, unknowable beast. "I don't think I can go back after this," Clara said, her voice trembling slightly. Elon gave her a sidelong glance, a brief flash of something unreadable in his eyes. "You won't need to. Once we're done here, you'll never have to go back to the way things were." Clara swallowed. She wasn't sure what Elon meant, but the uncertainty in his tone only added to her unease. The road ahead began to curve, and just as Clara thought they would finally see some sign of civilization, a massive structure appeared on the horizon. It loomed in the distance like an ominous shadow against the vastness of the desert, its silhouette dark and jagged against the twilight sky. "There it is," Elon said, his voice calm, almost reverential. "The Obsidian Facility." Clara's breath caught in her throat as they drew closer. The facility was unlike anything she had ever seen. It was made of black stone, jagged and angular, with walls that seemed to shimmer in the fading light. No windows, no doors, just a looming, oppressive presence. Elon parked the Tesla a few feet away from the entrance. There was no security, no visible staff, just an enormous, sealed metal hatch that appeared to be the only way in. "Are you sure this is safe?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elon turned to her, his expression unreadable. "It's more than safe. It's necessary." He stepped out of the car and walked toward the hatch without hesitation. Clara followed, her heels clicking sharply against the gravel. As she reached the door, a chill swept over her, the kind that seemed to seep into her very bones. She paused, hesitating for a moment. There was something wrong about this place, something that made her heart race. Elon reached for the panel next to the hatch, his fingers tracing over the cold surface. After a moment, the hatch groaned open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down into the depths. "After you," Elon said, a slight smile on his lips. Clara stepped forward, the darkness swallowing her whole as she descended into the unknown. The stairs seemed to go on forever, winding down into the heart of the earth. The air grew colder with each step, and Clara's breath turned to mist as she moved deeper into the facility. Her pulse quickened, and her stomach churned. At the bottom of the stairs, the passage opened up into a vast chamber. The walls were smooth and reflective, gleaming with an unnatural sheen. It was as though the entire room was made of glass. Clara's reflection followed her, always a step behind. It seemed wrong, as if the reflection were slightly delayed or out of sync with her movements. "Elon," she called, but her voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. "What is this place?" Elon was already several paces ahead, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. "This is the heart of the facility, the mirror chamber. It's where we test the boundaries of perception." Clara turned, feeling her heart rate quicken as she saw her own reflection staring back at her. But it wasn't just her reflection. There were others, strange, distorted versions of herself, flickering in the mirrors. They were whispering, their lips moving in synchronized movements that didn't match the timing of her own. "Elon," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Elon." But when she turned to look at him, he was gone. The room seemed to shift around her, the reflections growing more distorted, more sinister. Clara's heart raced as the shadows in the mirrors began to move, their movements jerky and unnatural, as though they were trying to break free from the glass. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stumbled backward, her eyes darting around in a panic. "What's happening? What is this?" But there was no answer, only the whispering voices, low, guttural, echoing in the corners of her mind. Clara stumbled backward, her legs trembling beneath her as the distorted reflections in the mirrors seemed to grow more pronounced. The whispers in the chamber intensified, swirling around her like an invisible storm. She felt a chill crawl up her spine as her breath became shallow and panicked. She reached out, touching the nearest mirror, expecting to feel the cool glass against her fingertips, but instead, the surface gave way like liquid, rippling and distorting beneath her hand. "Clara?" Elon's voice echoed from the darkness, cold and distant. Clara spun around, her heart thudding in her chest. "Elon, where are you?" She couldn't see him, only hear his voice, low and calm, resonating through the chamber. It was as if he were speaking from everywhere at once. The room was alive with strange energy, the reflections now twisting into grotesque shapes, flickering and distorting, moving without reason. "Elon!" Clara called out again, but the words felt swallowed by the vastness of the room. Her pulse quickened as she backed toward one of the walls, her hands skimming the cold, smooth surface for any way out. But all she found was the growing, suffocating reflection of herself. There was no escape. Suddenly a low hum filled the room, vibrating the air around her. The walls seemed to pulse with dark energy, their once smooth surfaces now rippling as though something was pushing from beneath them. Clara's breath caught in her throat as a series of low, rumbling growls echoed through the chamber, almost like a voice, speaking in a language she couldn't understand. "Elon!" she screamed, her voice breaking. From the shadows ahead, Elon emerged, his figure bathed in a strange, ghostly light. He walked toward her as though nothing were out of the ordinary, his expression calm and composed, as always. "It's not what you think, Clara," he said softly, his eyes never leaving her face. "What do you mean?" she gasped, her mind racing. "What is this place? What's happening?" "This is the true project," Elon explained, his tone unsettlingly serene. "Not just a research facility. We're pushing the boundaries of human perception, pushing the limits of reality itself. The mirrors here aren't just reflections, they're windows to other dimensions, other realities." Clara's stomach churned. "Other dimensions? What are you talking about?" "The human mind is confined by its understanding of reality," Elon continued, his voice almost hypnotic. "But these mirrors, they allow us to see beyond, to see the true nature of the universe, the possibilities, and with that knowledge, we can reshape everything." Clara's head spun as she processed his words. She had always known Elon to be an ambitious visionary, but this was madness. She had seen the changes in him over the past months, an unsettling obsession with the unknown, a growing distance between them, but she never imagined it would lead here to this nightmare. "This isn't the future," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "This is insanity. You're playing with things you don't understand. Elon, we have to leave, now." But Elon didn't seem to hear her. His eyes were fixed on the center of the room, where the reflections of Clara and the other distorted versions of herself seemed to writhe and contort. They were moving toward the mirrors now, their expressions twisted with malice. "Elon, please," Clara begged, her fear rising to a fever pitch. "We need to leave." But instead of responding, Elon stepped toward the center of the chamber, as if drawn to the reflections. Clara grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve, but he didn't flinch. His eyes were glazed over, his face pale, as if he were staring into something far beyond her. "You can't stop it," Elon murmured. "The truth is here. We're all part of it. This is the next stage of evolution, Clara. We're going to change everything." "No," Clara whispered, pulling him back with all her strength. "Elon, this isn't the way." But her words were drowned out by the growing roar of the mirrors, a cacophony of voices that seemed to scream and whisper in unison. The reflections of Clara and the others reached out from the mirrors, their faces contorting into grotesque versions of her own. They were trying to pull her in. Clara stumbled backward, her pulse hammering in her ears. She felt her feet slipping as she backed away, but the room seemed to warp around her, the walls closing in, the reflections now coming to life. "Elon, get out of here," she cried. But Elon remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the chaotic reflections that were now pouring out of the mirrors like liquid. It was as if they were no longer reflections at all, but living entities, crawling toward them with sinister intent. Clara grabbed Elon's arm once more, desperate. But the moment her fingers touched his skin, the world around her seemed to shatter. In an instant, Clara was no longer standing in the chamber. She was falling, tumbling through an endless void, her body weightless and disoriented. Her breath came in frantic gasps as she flailed, trying to find something to hold on to, but there was nothing, just endless blackness, stretching out in every direction. "Elon!" she screamed into the void, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. The sensation of falling intensified, and Clara's stomach churned as she tried to focus, to make sense of what was happening. But the more she tried to comprehend it, the further she fell. Suddenly, with a sickening jolt, her feet slammed against solid ground. She gasped, her hands instinctively reaching out to steady herself, but there was nothing beneath her fingers but smooth, cold glass. She was surrounded by mirrors, but not just any mirrors. These were ancient, cracked, their surfaces warped and distorted. They were cracked like the reflection of someone's worst nightmares, distorted and twisted images of herself, staring back at her from all directions. And there, in the center of the mirrors, stood Elon. His face was blank, a shadow of his former self. He seemed distant, almost unrecognizable. His eyes locked onto hers, but there was no warmth, no recognition, only an eerie emptiness. Clara's heart skipped a beat as the reflection of Elon in the mirrors began to change. His image flickered, and suddenly it wasn't just him. It was something else, something darker. The Elon standing before her in the mirror began to smile. A smile that wasn't his, a smile that seemed unnatural, twisted, like it was pulled from something far darker. The mirror Elon spoke in a voice that wasn't his own, his tone deep and guttural. "You should have never come here, Clara. Now it's too late." Clara staggered backward, her body trembling as the reflection of Elon twisted and contorted before her eyes. The smile on the mirror Elon's face stretched unnaturally wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth that gleamed in the pale, flickering light of the chamber. His eyes, once bright and inquisitive, were now empty pits, devoid of life. His gaze fixed on Clara with a malice that sent a cold shiver down her spine. "You've come too far, Clara," the mirror Elon rasped, his voice low and haunting. "This place, this reality, it's not meant for you." Clara's chest tightened, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. She wanted to run, to escape, but the mirrors around her seemed to close in, their cracked surfaces warping and distorting. The images of Elon, each more grotesque than the last, swirled and multiplied, reflecting every angle of her panic-stricken face. "Elon," she cried, her voice cracking, "what's happening to you?" The real Elon stood motionless, still trapped in the madness of the mirror world. He didn't respond. He didn't even blink. His gaze remained locked on Clara, but there was no recognition, no empathy. The man she had worked for, the man she had trusted, was no longer there. Instead, she was faced with an imposter, a twisted version of him that had been consumed by the dark forces within the facility. Clara took a step forward, her feet unsteady beneath her. "Elon, please." She reached out, hoping for some sign of the man she knew, but her fingers passed through the cold, glassy surface of the mirror, as if there were nothing there at all. The twisted smile on the reflection grew wider, and for a moment, Clara thought she saw something else. Something far darker, lurking behind Elon's features. It was as if his reflection was a veil for something far more sinister. "You think you can escape this place?" the mirror Elon whispered, his voice now a deep growl. "There is no escape. There is only transformation." Suddenly Clara felt a cold pressure building in her chest. It was as if the mirrors themselves were pulling her in, drawing her closer to the glassy surface. She fought against the invisible force, her hands clawing at the air, but the more she struggled, the stronger the pull became. "No!" she screamed, panic overtaking her. She stumbled backward, her feet slipping as she tried to break free from the grip of the mirrors. But the more she fought, the more the mirrors seemed to multiply, each one reflecting a different version of herself, each one contorted, twisted, and malevolent. "Elon, please," Clara cried, tears streaming down her face. "Help me." But there was no response. Her mind raced as she tried to think of a way out. The mirrors were closing in, and the pressure in her chest was becoming unbearable. She could feel the air thinning, as though the very room itself was suffocating her. Desperation clawed at her as she looked around the room, her eyes scanning for any exit, any sign of hope. And then she saw it. In the far corner of the chamber, partially hidden behind a cluster of mirrors, was a door. A heavy metal door, its edges coated with rust and grime. It looked old, ancient even, but it was an exit, a chance for freedom. Without thinking, Clara sprinted toward it, her legs burning with the effort. She ignored the pull of the mirrors, focusing solely on the door. Her hand reached for the cold metal handle, her fingers trembling as she gripped it. But just as she was about to open it, a deafening crack echoed through the room. The mirrors around her shattered, their fragments flying through the air like shards of glass. The reflections of Elon and the other twisted versions of herself shattered along with them, their screams filling the air. Clara stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked around, her breath caught in her throat as the fragments of glass fell to the floor. The shattered mirrors had exposed something far darker beneath the surface, a hidden doorway leading deep into the heart of the facility. "Elon," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. She looked to him, but he still stood motionless, as though trapped in a trance. Suddenly, a sound emerged from the depths of the hidden passage, a low, guttural growl. Clara's skin crawled as the darkness of the passage beckoned to her. Something, or someone, was waiting for her inside. With no other choice, Clara pushed open the door and stepped into the unknown. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow hallway that stretched deep into the facility. The air was thick with dust, the walls damp with moisture, and the only sound was the echo of Clara's footsteps as she ventured deeper into the unknown. Her heart raced in her chest, but there was no turning back now. The hallway was dark, the faint light from behind her casting long shadows across the floor. The walls seemed to pulse as though the very structure of the facility were alive, breathing, watching her every move. Clara's mind raced with questions. What was this place? What had Elon uncovered in his quest for knowledge? And more importantly, what had it done to him? She pressed on, the floor beneath her feet creaking with every step. The deeper she went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as if the air itself was suffocating her, pushing in from all sides. The walls seemed to close in, and the low hum of machinery filled the space, the sound growing louder with each passing moment. Finally, she reached the end of the hallway. Before her stood a massive door, its surface dark and ancient, as though it had been there for centuries. The air around it felt charged with an energy she couldn't comprehend. She knew deep down that this was the heart of the facility, the source of whatever madness had taken hold of Elon. Taking a deep breath, Clara reached for the door handle. It was cold to the touch, and as she turned it, the door groaned open with a heavy mechanical sound. Inside was a vast chamber, unlike anything Clara had ever seen before. The walls were lined with strange glowing symbols, and in the center of the room stood a large pedestal. Upon the pedestal rested a massive black stone, smooth, shiny, and pulsing with an unnatural energy. Elon was standing in front of the stone, his back to her. He was still, his arms raised, as though he were performing some kind of ritual. His eyes were closed, and his face was contorted in an expression of pure concentration. "Elon," Clara cried, stepping forward. "Stop, you don't know what you're doing." But Elon didn't respond. He remained frozen, his body rigid, as if he were bound by some unseen force. The black stone before him began to hum, the air vibrating with an overwhelming power. Clara's chest tightened as she watched in horror. She could feel the energy emanating from the stone, a dark, malevolent force that seemed to reach out and grab hold of her very soul. And then, the ground beneath her feet began to shake. The shaking grew more intense, the walls of the chamber groaning as though the very foundation of the facility was cracking apart. Clara stumbled back, her hands bracing against the walls for support as the entire room seemed to come alive with a pulsing, chaotic energy. The stone on the pedestal began to crack, fissures spreading across its surface like veins of darkness. The hum grew louder, rising to a deafening pitch. Clara's mind raced as she realized that whatever Elon had uncovered here, it was far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. "Elon," she screamed, her voice barely audible over the deafening noise, "you have to stop. It's too late." But Elon didn't hear her. He remained motionless, his arms still outstretched, as the stone continued to crack and split. A dark mist began to pour from the cracks, swirling around the room like a living entity. Clara could feel it, its cold, suffocating presence closing in on her. The mist began to take shape, forming twisted, monstrous figures that loomed over her. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, their forms shifting and flickering as if they were not fully of this world. "Elon!" Clara screamed again, but there was no response. The stone had fully cracked open now, and from within it, something dark and malevolent began to rise. It was too late. The ritual was complete. The dark mist, now thick and swirling, seemed to possess a mind of its own. It clawed at Clara's skin, wrapping around her limbs like tendrils of ice. She fought against it, but it was relentless, pushing her back with its suffocating presence. Her eyes locked onto Elon, who stood motionless in front of the now shattered stone. His body was rigid, his face expressionless, his once vibrant eyes now hollow, as if the man she had known was no longer there. Only the empty shell remained, an empty vessel for whatever dark force had taken hold. "Elon!" Clara cried again, her voice breaking with desperation. She stumbled forward, her feet dragging against the oppressive atmosphere. But the mist made each step feel like a battle against a powerful, unseen force. The shapes in the mist continued to flicker, their twisted forms growing more solid, more defined. She couldn't just stand there. This was it. This was the moment she either stopped the madness, or they were both lost forever. "Elon!" she shouted, her voice hoarse. "You have to snap out of it. Fight it, Elon. You're still in there." For a brief moment, there was a flicker in his eyes, something human, something that almost seemed to respond. But the look vanished almost immediately, replaced by the same cold emptiness. Clara's heart sank. The force that had claimed him was too strong. Suddenly the mist surrounding her began to shift violently, and the monstrous figures within it loomed larger, their distorted forms now fully realized. Their faces were twisted masks of agony, their eyes black voids that seemed to suck in the very light around them. Their mouths, stretched wide, grotesque and inhuman, with rows of sharp teeth glistening in the darkness. The ground beneath Clara trembled, the room shaking as if the facility itself were alive and fighting to keep her from interfering. The figures advanced, closing in on her, their movements jerky and unnatural. Clara barely had time to react before one of them reached out, its cold hand grabbing her by the wrist with terrifying force. She screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the growling, inhuman sounds of the creatures. The mist around her thickened, constricting her lungs, choking her. "Get away from her!" Elon's voice finally broke through the chaos. His tone was ragged, weak, but there was a glimmer of something resembling the man he once was. He staggered forward, his arms shaking, his body trembling as though he were fighting against an invisible force pulling him back. The creature holding Clara tightened its grip, its nails digging into her flesh as it began to drag her toward the pedestal, where the shattered stones still hummed with dark energy. Clara's vision blurred, her limbs growing weak from the suffocating pull of the mist. "Elon!" she gasped, her voice barely audible as the creature yanked her closer. "Please, fight it." And then, in that final moment of despair, something shifted in the air, something deep and primal. Elon's body lurched as though he had been struck by an invisible force. His head jerked back, his eyes snapping open. The human side of him was fighting to break free from whatever dark presence had overtaken him. His mouth opened in a soundless scream, and for a split second, Clara could see him, the man she had once known, desperately trying to fight the force inside him. "Elon, please," Clara cried, her voice breaking. The creatures surrounding them began to screech, their eyes glowing brighter, as if sensing the change in the air. The mist swirled faster, and the room seemed to tremble with the buildup of energy. But it was too late. Elon's body stiffened, his eyes going wide in horror. A low, guttural voice, one that was not his own, emerged from his mouth, an eerie whisper that echoed around the chamber. "You cannot stop it. You are all mine." In that instant, Elon collapsed to the floor, his body convulsing violently as the dark force inside him took control completely. Clara screamed as she watched his figure warp and distort, his skin beginning to melt away, replaced by something far darker, something inhuman. And then, with a deafening crack, the floor beneath Clara gave way. The chamber fell into chaos as the floor crumbled beneath Clara's feet. She was thrown into darkness, her body hurtling downward into the abyss below. The mist, the creatures, and the horrific transformation of Elon faded into a blur as her senses overloaded. The falling seemed endless, like she was tumbling through space itself. Her lungs burned with each breath, the air thick and suffocating. But just as she thought she couldn't take it any longer, the ground beneath her suddenly solidified, catching her with a brutal jolt. Clara gasped for air, her body aching from the fall. She opened her eyes, disoriented, and found herself in another chamber, one that was eerily quiet. The walls around her were cracked, the ceiling broken in places, revealing nothing but the void above. But there was something else. She was no longer alone. A figure stood in the shadows of the far corner. Clara's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the figure, Elon. But it wasn't the Elon she knew. His body was twisted and wrong, a grotesque version of himself, his face now completely alien, his eyes black and hollow. His body was covered in strange markings, and his skin had taken on a dark, almost charred appearance. "Elon," Clara whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "What have you done?" He turned toward her, his mouth stretching into a wicked, unnatural smile. "You were never supposed to be a part of this, Clara," he said in a voice that was not his own. "But now, you will join us." Clara's heart raced as she backed away from the advancing figure. The ground beneath her seemed to pulse, vibrating with the same dark energy that had consumed the facility. She had to escape. With a burst of adrenaline, Clara scrambled to her feet, her legs trembling as she ran toward the far side of the chamber. But as she reached the wall, she realized there was nowhere to go. The walls were closing in, the space growing tighter and more suffocating with every passing second. "Elon, stop!" She screamed, but there was no response. The last thing Clara saw before the darkness overtook her was Elon's twisted figure, his eyes glowing with malevolent energy as he stepped toward her, his body shifting and writhing like something out of a nightmare. The Obsidian Facility stood silent, its once thriving laboratories now abandoned and crumbling. The darkness that had consumed Elon and the reality-altering powers he had sought to harness had claimed everything in its path. In the ruins of the facility, there were whispers, rumors of strange occurrences, of people who had ventured too deep into the heart of the complex, never to return. The experiments had gone too far, the knowledge too dangerous to contain, and among the ruins, the echoes of Elon's voice could still be heard, reverberating through the walls, a chilling reminder of the darkness that had once taken hold.